Welcome, dear listener. These are not the stories of kings or conquerors, but of the quieter lives that shaped our past, bakers who rose before dawn, toll keepers who counted coins by candlelight, and workers who built their days around ledgers, loaves, and long-forgotten rules. Their histories may seem ordinary, even dull, but in their details lies the true rhythm of survival. Tonight, we will wander slowly through these forgotten corners of the past, tracing the hidden patterns of daily life, one story at a time. Settle in, let the pace carry you gently, and allow history's quiet voices to keep you company as you drift to sleep. Paris, in the years after the First World War, was a place that seemed to breathe in both light and smoke, both life and exhaustion. The war had ended in 1918, leaving France scarred, weary, and yet oddly hungry for distraction. Millions of men had been lost. Millions more had returned, maimed or silent, carrying memories that could not be easily spoken. The boulevards of Paris filled once again with laughter and music, but beneath the surface, another kind of hunger lingered, one that could not be satisfied with cabaret songs or champagne. It was in this space, between recovery and ruin, that heroin found its way into Parisian life. Not suddenly, not with fanfare, but quietly, like a shadow creeping along the edge of a gaslit street. At the time, heroin was not the infamous word it has become for us. It was, instead, a product of science, born of the laboratories of Bayer in Germany at the end of the 19th century. Marketed originally as a cough suppressant and as a supposedly non-addictive substitute for morphine, heroin entered the medical world with the promise of relief. Doctors prescribed it with little hesitation. Pharmacists stocked it alongside tonics and powders, and patients swallowed or injected it without the sense that they were stepping into danger. By the 1920s, the drug's darker reputation was beginning to spread, but it had not yet been placed under the strict controls we now associate with narcotics. In Paris, this meant it was available not everywhere, not openly, but in enough places that those who sought it could find it. Pharmacies kept it in small bottles. Clubs in Montmartre and Montparnasse whispered of it. Foreign visitors, arriving with the hope of drinking in the city's wild nights, sometimes found heroin as easily as they found wine, you might imagine. The swirl of jazz brought by African-American musicians, the paintings of Picasso and the words of Hemingway, all of these were real. But so too were the quiet rooms where students, artists, or even war veterans drew heroin into glass syringes and slipped away into the dream it promised. The drug did not choose its users. Some were men who had returned from the trenches, unable to silence the explosions in their minds. Morphine had been given freely in wartime hospitals, and for many, others were artists, fascinated by altered states of mind, convinced that heroin might open doors to creativity. And still others were simply caught by chance-taking it for a cough, a pain, a doctor's suggestion, till the medicine became the master. Heroin in 1920s Paris was not yet fully criminal, but it was already becoming notorious. Newspaper articles hinted at its dangers. Police reports occasionally listed seizures of powders and vials, usually tied to smuggling routes that connected Europe to Asia. The League of Nations, still young, had begun to speak of narcotics control, linking heroin to the broader problem of opium trafficking. Yet, For the ordinary Parisian, it was less a question of law and more a question of need. Imagine, for a moment, the small apartment of a student in the Latin Quarter. The walls are damp, the floorboards creak, and the window looks out onto a street that never fully sleeps. The student has spent the day copying notes, drinking black coffee, and trying to drown the uncertainty of the future in books. At night, with friends or alone, a small vial of heroin is opened, a powder mixed with water, a needle prepared. Relief arrives quickly, warm and heavy, as if the city itself has grown quiet. For that night, the hunger is gone. The heroin craze of Paris was not a public spectacle. It did not march in parades or shout from rooftops. It moved quietly in the corners of cafes, in the back rooms of apothecaries, in whispered exchanges between friends. Yet it was there, shaping lives, ending some, altering many. The irony, of course, is that heroin was still, in some ways, respectable. Doctors continued to prescribe it, though more cautiously. Advertisements from the earlier years lingered in memory, promising safety and relief. The word itself, heroin, derived from the German heroisch, meaning strong or heroic, a name chosen to suggest vigor and power. How strange it must have felt to those who found themselves trapped by it, their strength drained, their lives narrowed. That the drug carried such a name at the same time, Paris was filled with foreign visitors. Americans, escaping prohibition at home, flocked to the city for drink, music, and freedom. Some encountered heroin here, just as they encountered absinthe or opium. In the smoky basements of Montmartre, one could find jazz musicians playing into the night, artists sketching feverishly, and in the background, a quiet ritual of powder and needle. These encounters fed into the myths of Paris as a place of wild freedom, though the reality for many users was far less romantic. The French authorities, meanwhile, struggled with how to respond. The police were more concerned with opium dens, which had been associated with Chinese immigrants in certain quarters, than with heroin quietly circulating among French citizens. International conferences pressured France to tighten controls, but enforcement remained patchy. In effect, the drug lingered in a gray zone, legal in some contexts, illegal in others, tolerated until it became too visible. For the individuals who fell into its grasp, the question was rarely one of legality. It was a matter of survival, of relief, of escape. Some found heroin in hospital wards, where it was still administered for severe pain. Others bought it in cafes or pharmacies. And for many, the line between use and addiction blurred quickly, unnoticed until it was too late. Yet heroin did not dominate Paris entirely. It was one element among many, a city alive with contradictions, where laughter and despair lived side by side. As you walk through its streets in your imagination, you might hear a jazz trumpet blaring from one window, a poet reciting in another, and, not far away, someone quietly preparing a syringe. All of it part of the same city, the same moment in time. Heroin's presence in Paris during the 1920s raises a question that echoes beyond its era. How does a society, weary from war and searching for comfort, navigate the fine line between medicine and poison, between relief and ruin? Heroin in 1920s Paris was not an isolated substance appearing by chance. It had roots, networks, and pathways that connected France to the wider world. At its base was the opium poppy, grown far beyond the Seine. Fields in Persia, India, and later in Southeast Asia fed the global supply of opium, which was processed into morphine and then refined into heroin. From there, routes stretched across oceans and borders, often carried by merchants, smugglers, or even diplomats. France, with its colonial empire and trade routes, became a natural conduit. Marseille, in particular, stood as a port where opium and morphine could arrive, be transformed, and then redistributed. By the mid-1920s, Marseille's reputation as a hub of the narcotics trade was growing, though not yet the infamous center of the French Connection that it would become decades later. The city already played a role in the movement of morphine base from Asia into Europe. Laboratories tucked into its alleys quietly refined morphine into heroin, producing a product far stronger than the crude opium smoked in dens or mixed into medicines. From there, the drug could make its way to Paris, hidden in shipments or carried by intermediaries, eventually landing in the hands of both doctors and dealers. Yet heroin in Paris was not only a product of smuggling, it still held a place in legitimate medicine. Pharmacies, under the right circumstances, could dispense it. Hospitals used it for severe cases. This overlap between the legal and the illicit blurred boundaries. A patient might receive heroin for a cough, then seek more through unofficial means. A soldier accustomed to morphine during the war might find heroin as a continuation. The thin veil between medicine and vice gave heroin its peculiar presence, never fully accepted, never fully banished. In the cafes of Montmartre and Montparnasse, heroin became one of several intoxicants that shaped the nightlife. Jazz clubs thrived, bringing sounds from across the Atlantic. Absinthe still flowed, though its reputation had dimmed. Cocaine, too, appeared in powder form, used by dancers, actors, or writers seeking energy. Among these, heroin had a quieter presence. Where cocaine lifted and excited, heroin dulled and soothed. Where alcohol made noise, heroin brought silence. Its users were not necessarily the loudest figures in the nightlife scene, but they were there in corners, in private rooms, their experiences as much a part of the city's undercurrent as the music and the dance. One group deeply touched by heroin in this period were veterans of the Great War. Morphine had been standard in field hospitals, and for some, dependence lingered long after demobilization. With morphine harder to obtain in peacetime, heroin became a substitute. For a man struggling with shattered nerves or chronic pain, heroin offered relief, even if temporary. These veterans did not always see themselves as addicts. They saw themselves as continuing a treatment, one that the war itself had introduced into their lives. Artists and writers formed another circle where heroin appeared. The 1920s were years of experimentation, not only in art, but in living. Writers like Jean Cocteau openly described their encounters with opium, while others whispered of heroin. For some, drugs seemed to promise access to deeper truths, to hidden layers of consciousness. But just as often, the reality was harsher: declining health, broken routines, and a quiet dependence that undermined creativity rather than fueling it. The myth of the drugged artist in Paris grew, but behind the myth were lives more fragile than glamorous. The French authorities began slowly to respond. The 1912 Hague Opium Convention had marked the first international attempt to control narcotics, but enforcement in the years after the war was uneven. France, like other nations, signed agreements, yet struggled to apply them effectively. Police reports in Paris occasionally listed heroin seizures, often linked to smuggling operations. But heroin's presence was never eradicated. Instead, it lingered, partly because of its dual status as both medicine and menace. Newspapers sometimes ran stories of overdoses, warnings to the public, or exposes on opium dens. These articles often carried a sensational tone, describing smoky rooms in Chinatown or glamorous figures wasting away under the influence of powders. Yet, the daily reality was less theatrical. More often, heroin addiction played out in quiet apartments, in the struggles of individuals who were neither criminals nor artists, but ordinary people caught between relief and ruin in the working-class districts of Paris. Heroin sometimes appeared as part of a larger pattern of escape. Alcohol was cheaper, more accessible, but heroin offered a different kind of forgetfulness. Those who used it might not speak of it openly, but its presence was felt in absences, work, declining health, debts that could not be explained. For families, the impact was quiet but real. The supply chains that fed Paris were not only international but also local. Small-time dealers operated in cafes, in alleys, sometimes even within pharmacies themselves. Some doctors, sympathetic or careless, wrote prescriptions with ease. Others turned a blind eye. The combination of smuggling networks, legal loopholes, and human need created a market that never fully disappeared, no matter how often the police intervened. On the international stage, pressure mounted. The League of Nations Opium Advisory Committee pushed for tighter controls, arguing that heroin was uniquely dangerous among narcotics. Reports noted its rapid addictiveness, its devastating health effects, and its spread through European capitals. France, as both a colonial power and a cultural center, could not ignore these calls. By the late 1920s, restrictions grew tighter, though never perfect. The government attempted to curtail production, limit prescriptions, and police smuggling routes. Still, in the cafes and rooms of Paris, heroin remained for users. The tightening laws meant something more immediate: difficulty in obtaining the drug. Some turned to more dangerous sources, buying impure heroin cut with other substances. Others sought morphine or opium instead. A few managed to stop, though withdrawal was harsh, poorly understood, and rarely supported by medical institutions at the time. Addiction was seen less as an illness than as a failing, a moral weakness, leaving sufferers to struggle largely in silence. The heroin craze of Paris was not a craze in the sense of open frenzy. It was quieter, more insidious. It never defined the entire city, but it threaded through enough of its streets, clubs, and hospitals to leave a mark. Paris remained a city of music, art, and laughter. But it was also a city where lives were quietly shaped in, sometimes broken by a powder that had once been promised as safe. By the end of the 1920s, heroin's reputation had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a medicine was now increasingly seen as a poison. International agreements pushed France toward stricter bans. Police efforts grew more aggressive. Yet, for those already caught in its grasp, laws did little to help. the question remained. In a city that had embraced heroin as both cure and escape, what would happen when the doors to supply began to close? By the end of the 1920s, the image of heroin in Paris had changed. What had once entered homes through doctors, prescriptions, or pharmacists, counters now increasingly carried the weight of stigma, secrecy, and prohibition. For nearly 3 decades, from its introduction by Bayer at the close of the 19th century to its place in the cafes and clubs of post-war Paris, heroin had been both a medicine and a menace. But the 1930s would tip the balance firmly toward menace, reshaping how the French state and society viewed not only heroin but narcotics in general. The change did not occur overnight. It was the result of overlapping pressures: medical recognition of heroin's addictiveness, international agreements that demanded stricter enforcement, and growing police awareness of smuggling networks that stretched from Marseille to Shanghai. Paris, for all its glamour, was not unique in this transformation. Berlin, London, and New York all experienced similar arcs. As heroin slipped from being a commodity of modern science into the shadows of criminalization, the French government, in response to the League of Nations' mounting demands, tightened its regulations. By the late 1920s, heroin was no longer sold in ordinary pharmacies, except under the strictest medical supervision. Import and export controls were reinforced. Laboratories in Marseille, once operating with relative freedom, faced greater scrutiny. The opium trade, long tolerated as part of France's colonial economy, came under sharper criticism. France, like other European powers, had built much of its wealth through colonial control of crops such as opium in Indochina. Now that very system was being questioned on moral and international grounds for users in Paris. The tightening of regulations meant change. Those who had once obtained heroin legally through prescriptions found access restricted. Addicts who had relied on steady supplies were forced into riskier markets. Dealers began to dilute heroin with other substances to stretch supply, leading to more overdoses and complications. Withdrawal, still poorly understood by medical science, left many in agony. Without support systems or treatment programs, addicts were left largely on their own. Hospitals, when they did intervene, often treated addiction as a matter of discipline rather than medicine. Patients might be isolated, their supply cut off suddenly, with little understanding of the physical and psychological torment involved. The modern concept of addiction as an illness requiring care had not yet taken hold. Instead, heroin users were often stigmatized, pitied at best, condemned at worst. The cultural image of heroin shifted in parallel. Writers and artists who had once flirted with drugs as part of the bohemian experiment grew quieter. Jean Cocteau, for example, turned his attention more fully to opium, leaving heroin less visible in literary circles. Newspaper reports painted heroin less as a medicine and more as a social threat. The drug that had once carried the heroic-sounding name now became synonymous with weakness, ruin, and secrecy. Yet the memory of heroin lingered in the creative fabric of Paris, the city's reputation as a place of wild experimentation and forbidden pleasures owed something to the presence of narcotics. Even if heroin itself was a quieter undercurrent than absinthe or opium, foreign visitors who came in search of liberation sometimes returned home with more than stories of jazz clubs. Paris's role as a crossroads of cultures ideas, and substances gave it an outsized influence on how drugs were imagined around the world at the same time. The city's heroin story was part of a larger shift in global drug control. The 1931 Geneva Convention on Narcotics set stricter quotas and reporting systems, further tightening the international noose around heroin production and distribution. France, under pressure, complied. The heroin market did not vanish. No prohibition ever truly erased demand, but it became smaller, more secretive, more dangerous. The years of casual prescriptions and ready access had ended by the early 1930s. Heroin addiction in Paris carried a different weight. It was no longer seen as the quiet continuation of wartime morphine use or as the experiment of avant-garde artists. It was seen instead as a problem of crime, of deviance, of personal failure. The compassion once extended to veterans gave way to suspicion. The tolerance of bohemians gave way to judgment. The heroin user became an outsider, even within the very city that had once quietly embraced the drug. The legacy of this shift would last. France's later struggles with heroin in the 1960s and 1970s, the so-called epideme de Heroin that ravaged communities, were shaped by the earlier history. The stigma, the criminalization, and the lack of medical infrastructure for treatment all traced back, in part, to the 1920s and 1930s. Paris had seen heroin before, had lived with it in its clubs, its hospitals, its cafes, and its homes, but it had not built the tools to address it. If you walk the streets of Paris today, the 1920s heroin craze leaves few visible traces. The cafes of Montparnasse still bustle with conversation. Jazz still echoes in the city's cultural memory. But the small rooms where students once drew heroin into glass syringes, the hospital wards where veterans found relief, the pharmacies where bottles were once sold, all of these are gone. Their history overshadowed by more glamorous memories of the Années Falls, the crazy years. And yet, heroin's story is a reminder that history is not only made in the visible, the celebrated, the loud. Sometimes it is made in the quiet corners, in the dull routines of medicine, in the hidden exchanges of powders, in the choices of individuals seeking relief from pain or from memory. Paris in the 1920s was a city of music and art, but it was also a city of heroin. However quietly that fact was lived. When we look back on that time, we are left with questions that reach far beyond Paris. How should societies balance the promise of medicine with the risk of addiction? How do we remember those whose lives unfolded not in the spotlight of cafes and galleries, but in the shadows of small apartments, alone with a vial and a needle? And most of all, what do we learn nor fail to learn when history hides its dull, uncomfortable truths beneath brighter lights? When you think of Rome, you might picture soaring arches, marble temples, and aqueducts stretching across valleys in graceful lines. The aqueducts are indeed one of the city's most famous achievements, bringing water from distant springs and mountains into the capital of an empire. But having water flow into the city was not the same as having water at your door. For many Romans, especially those living in the crowded insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that housed the majority of the city's population, water did not arrive in a pipe or a tap. It had to be fetched, carried, and paid for. This task fell to the water carriers, known in various sources as equerri or equators. These men and sometimes women formed an invisible but vital layer in Rome's social and economic fabric. Their job was simple, repetitive, and exhausting: to take water from public fountains, reservoirs, or cisterns, and bring it to households, taverns, bathhouses, and workshops. Rome in the 1st century CE was a city of perhaps 1 million people. To keep it alive required a staggering volume of water. Estimates vary, but scholars suggest that the aqueducts together supplied hundreds of millions of liters each day. Much of this went to public baths, fountains, and gardens, but individual families still needed water for cooking, cleaning, drinking, and craft. Wealthy houses, domos, could sometimes arrange private connections to the aqueducts. Poorer families relied on public fountains located at intervals throughout the city. Picture a fountain at a busy street corner. Water flows steadily from a stone spout, splashing into a large basin. Around it gather slaves, children, and hired carriers, each with clay jars or wooden buckets. The water is free in theory. The aqueducts were a gift of the state, but the act of transporting it was not. If you lived on the 5th floor of an insula, climbing down and up with heavy amphorae several times a day was nearly impossible. So you paid someone else to do it. The carriers filled their jars, balanced them on wooden yokes across their shoulders, and trudged up staircases dark and steep. A single jar might hold 20 liters. Imagine the strain of lifting and carrying such loads again and again, day after day. It was work that wore down the body, especially the back and knees. The carriers earned little, yet they became indispensable in the life of the city. There are hints in Roman writings about these figures. Martial, the poet, mentions slaves fetching water in his epigrams. Legal inscriptions refer to disputes over water rights, sometimes involving carriers accused of diverting water or selling it illegally. The jurist Frontinus, who wrote a treatise on Rome's aqueducts in the late 1st century CE, complains of abuses: private citizens bribing carriers to divert water, pipes illegally tapped, fountains drained faster than intended. Behind his technical details lies the everyday truth that the work of transporting water opened countless small opportunities for corruption and negotiation. For the ordinary resident of Rome, the water carrier was a familiar sight. You would hear their footsteps on the stairs, the slosh of jars, the groan of wooden yokes. You might bargain with them for a regular delivery. If you were wealthy, you might employ your own slaves for the task. If you were poor, you might ration water carefully, relying on what you could carry yourself. The carrier bridged the gap between the city's grand aqueducts and the small needs of daily survival. This work was especially visible in neighborhoods far from the Tiber or from natural springs. In the Subura, a dense, noisy district filled with shops and tenements, water carriers passed constantly. Workshops making leather, cloth, or metal all needed water. Taverns required it for mixing wine. Bakers needed it for dough. The Subura's narrow lanes echoed with calls and clattering jars, a reminder that Rome's survival rested not only on emperors and senators, but also on these anonymous laborers. It is easy to imagine the monotony of their days. Rise early, before the sun grew too hot. Collect jars, ropes, and yokes. Wait at the fountain, jostling with others. Haul the load to a customer. Climb the stairs. Deliver the water. Repeat Meals were likely simple: bread, olives, perhaps some cheese or porridge. Payment came in coins, sometimes in food or favors. There was no glory in the work, but there was steady demand. Over time, water carriers became part of Rome's urban rhythm. They were rarely praised, rarely recorded, yet without them the city would have choked. A fountain could supply a street, but it could not carry water up 6 flights of stairs. A bathhouse might boast marble pools, but it still required countless jars brought to stoke fires, clean floors, or supply-side rooms. Even temples and shrines needed carriers to keep their basins filled. For the historian, the challenge lies in piecing together these lives from fragments. An inscription here, a complaint there, a passing line in a satire. The water carrier's story is not dramatic, not filled with battles or emperors. It is the story of wariness, necessity, and survival. And it leaves us with a question. In a city celebrated for its engineering marvels, how much of daily life still depended not on aqueducts of stone, but on shoulders of flesh? To understand the place of water carriers in Rome, you must remember that water in the city was never simply a natural gift. It was a political tool, a marker of power, and a resource tightly bound to law. The aqueducts were funded, maintained, and celebrated by the emperors, who claimed credit for ensuring Rome's endless supply. Arches bore inscriptions naming the benefactors. Coins depicted flowing streams and abundant fountains. But the actual delivery of water into homes was another matter entirely. And here the water carriers lived in the shadow of state control. Rome had a curator, a quorum, an official responsible for overseeing the aqueducts and the city's water supply. By the late 1st century CE, the office was held by men of senatorial rank. Frontinus, who wrote his treatise De Aquedicta Orbis Rami around 97 CE, was one such curator. His text is filled with numbers, pipe measurements, flow rates, and lists of aqueducts. Yet hidden among these technical details are glimpses of the constant tug-of-war between official regulations and private practices. Frontinus laments that private citizens bribed workers to attach illegal lead pipes to aqueduct channels. He complains that water meant for public fountains or baths was being siphoned into private houses. Carriers, too, played a role in this gray economy. Some diverted water from its intended outlets to sell directly. Others collaborated with householders, eager for more than their legal share. What seems like a dull technical problem, a missing fraction of water flow here. A miscounted pipe. There was, in fact, a daily struggle over who had access to one of the city's most vital resources for ordinary Romans. The rules were clear in theory, but hazy in practice. Public fountains were free to all. Wealthy citizens could apply for legal private connections, often requiring imperial approval. Everyone else depended on what they could carry, or what they could afford to pay others to carry. The state celebrated the generosity of water, but in practice, water still had to be bought with coin, sweat, or both. The water carriers occupied an awkward position in this system. They were essential to making fountains usable for those who lived far or high above street level. Yet their work also blurred into illegality when they sold water in bulk or drew more than their fair share. In some inscriptions, aquarii are accused of corruption. In others, they appear in official lists, suggesting some recognition of their trade, much like bakers, porters, or mule drivers. They lived on the edge between regulated necessity and tolerated abuse. Think, for a moment, about the physical structure of an insula. The multi-story tenement where most Romans lived. The ground floor might house shops. Above them rose 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories of cramped apartments. There were no elevators, no pumps, no pipes carrying water to the upper floors. To live on the top floor meant cheaper rent, but also greater dependence on carriers. To live closer to the ground meant convenience, but at a higher cost. Even in housing, water shaped daily inequality. The city's geography deepened these divides. In districts near the Tiber, residents might supplement fountain water with river water, less clean but free. In hillier regions, such as the Esquiline or the Aventine, hauling water uphill made it even more valuable. Carriers charged more for deliveries to steeper streets or higher floors. Water was heavy. A single liter weighs about 1 kilogram. A carrier bringing 40 liters to a 5th-floor apartment was effectively lifting and transporting the weight of a grown man. Multiply this by dozens of trips each day, and you begin to sense the strain etched into their muscles. Evidence from tomb inscriptions suggests that some water carriers organized into collegia associations or guilds. These groups offered burial funds, social ties, and a modest sense of identity. They were not prestigious, but they created community for men whose labor was otherwise invisible. In Roman society, where status mattered so deeply, even a humble collegium gave meaning. To belong was to have a name and a place, however small. At the same time, carriers were sometimes resented. The wealthier classes looked down on manual labor, treating carriers as little more than beasts of burden. Satirists mocked them, grouping them with dung collectors or night soil men. The upper classes may have enjoyed their daily baths and fountains, but they rarely acknowledged the human backs that kept these luxuries possible. Carriers existed in a kind of social shadow, needed, tolerated, but never celebrated. Still, without them, life in Rome would have been far harsher. Consider the baker kneading dough before dawn. Without steady water deliveries, his ovens could not fire. Consider the taverna, where wine was always mixed with water. Without carriers, the drink would not flow. Consider the Falonica, the laundry workshop, where clothes were cleaned with water, clay, and sometimes even urine. Every tunic in the city relied indirectly on the muscles of water carriers. Even religion tied into their labor. Temples required water for purification rites, sacrifices, and washing. Fountains themselves were often decorated with statues of nymphs and gods, blurring the line between infrastructure and sacred space. Carriers who filled basins for shrines or cleaned temple steps played a role, however small, in sustaining Rome's spiritual life. The quiet ubiquity of their work raises an important point. Rome was a city built on systems, but those systems always relied on people at the bottom. The aqueducts could deliver water across valleys and hills, but they could not climb tenement stairs. Only human bodies could bridge that final distance. And so the carriers trudged on, day after day, straining under yokes, sweating in tunics patched and worn, trading coins for water for survival. But as the city grew larger and more crowded, and as competition for water intensified, one question loomed: how long could a system so dependent on fragile human labor sustain a metropolis of 1,000,000 souls. Imagine once more the clatter of wooden buckets, the slap of sandals against stone, the slow heave of a man straining under weight. For centuries, such sounds filled the alleys and stairwells of Rome. Yet, when we turn to history books, we find little mention of the water carriers. Their names are not recorded in triumphal arches. Their deeds are not carved in marble. Instead, their lives passed much like the water they hauled, flowing quietly, leaving only faint traces in the soil of memory. The end of a water carrier's day often looked little different from its beginning. After hours of hauling, a man might sit in the courtyard of his insula, shoulders aching, palms roughened. The coins earned were meager, enough, perhaps, for bread, olive oil, a little wine, and rent for a cramped room shared with family or fellow workers. Rarely did their earnings allow for leisure, let alone comfort. If he belonged to a collegium, he might attend a gathering, drink watered wine with comrades, and contribute to the burial fund. Such small rituals gave shape to lives otherwise worn down by labor. Illness and injury were constant threats. Repeated strain on the back and knees, exposure to the elements, and the risk of accidents on crowded staircases made for short working lives. When a carrier could no longer shoulder the yoke, he faced a grim future, reliance on family, charity, or the uncertain support of his guild. The city offered little in the way of social safety nets beyond these fragile networks. Survival was a balancing act, as precarious as a brimming bucket on a narrow stair, and yet water carriers were not entirely invisible. Inscriptions found in Rome and its provinces occasionally mention a quarry by name. One epitaph honors a man who spent his life in the trade, his fellow workers funding the stone to mark his grave. Another notes the contribution of carriers to a public fountain, perhaps an act of piety or pride. These traces remind us that even in obscurity, the carriers left ripples in the historical record. Their work also reveals the contradictions of Roman society. Here was a city that celebrated its aqueducts as symbols of civilization, marvels that impressed visitors and inspired later engineers. Yet, at the same time, the smooth operation of these wonders depended on men trudging through mud, carrying sloshing jars, repeating the same motions hour after hour. It was a reminder that infrastructure, no matter how advanced, always relies on human effort at the ground level. The decline of Rome did not come in a single moment, nor did the carriers vanish overnight. But as aqueducts fell into disrepair, as population shrank, and as urban life grew more precarious, the demand for their work shifted. In the medieval centuries that followed, the ruins of aqueducts became pasture for goats, their arches looming over a much smaller city. Carriers remained, but now their task was not supplementing a vast system, but supplying survival in a city where fountains had dried and grandeur had faded. The burden of water did not disappear. It simply changed shape. Looking at their story from today's distance, one might be tempted to dismiss it as trivial, the tale of men carrying buckets. But think of what it represents. Each drop they hauled was a thread in the vast fabric of Rome. Food prepared, clothes washed, bodies, streets swept, temples purified. The city could not have functioned without them. And yet their anonymity shows how history often privileges the visible and the powerful. leaving the laboring masses in silence. There is also something humbling in their example. In an age when we turn a tap and expect water to flow effortlessly, it is easy to forget the physicality of survival in earlier times. For the carriers, water was not an abstract utility, but a weight on the shoulders, a strain in the spine, a test of endurance. To live in Rome was to depend every single day on the sweat of men whose names are mostly lost, unnoticed at first glance, but essential to the life they sustained. Their story is not one of triumph, but of persistence, of countless journeys up and down narrow stairs, of strength spent in service to others, of lives lived in quiet obscurity. The next time you hear of Rome's aqueducts, arches gleaming in the sun, remember the men who bent beneath their yokes, moving water drop by drop, day after day. They are the invisible hands that kept the eternal city alive. For, in the end, history is not only built by emperors and engineers, but also by those who carried the weight, literally, of civilization on their backs. The medieval traveler rarely moved freely. Whether a merchant carrying bales of wool, a farmer bringing a cart of vegetables to market, or a pilgrim with little more than sandals and faith, every road led sooner or later to a gate, a bridge, or a post where someone waited to demand payment. That someone was the toll collector. Picture a wooden gatehouse straddling a road near a river crossing. Beside it stands a man in a rough woolen tunic, quill tucked behind his ear, a small chest at his feet. Before him sits a ledger bound in worn parchment, its pages filled with neat but cramped Latin script. Each line represents a payment, a halfpenny from a farmer with 2 pigs, a larger fee from a merchant's cart laden with salt, a reduced rate for a local monastery's wagon. The toll collector's task was simple to describe, but tedious to execute, to keep the record, to collect the coin, to ensure that no one passed without paying what was due. Tolls were as varied as the lands that imposed them. In some places, they were fixed charges, carefully listed in charters. 1 penny for a horse, 2 for a cart, more for a wagon carrying wine barrels. Elsewhere, they were negotiable, subject to the toll collector's judgment and the bargaining power of the traveler. A man with little to his name might plead for mercy, offering a few eggs in place of coin. A wealthy merchant might grumble but pay, knowing that delay was costlier than compliance. Behind the toll stood authority, the lord of a manor, the abbot of a monastery, or even the crown itself. Roads and bridges required maintenance, and tolls were justified as the means to fund it. In reality, tolls were as much about asserting control as about repairing planks or stones. To pay a toll was to acknowledge the right of someone else to govern passage, to affirm one's place in a hierarchy where movement itself could be taxed. The toll collector lived at the intersection of power and resentment. To lords, he was a servant, entrusted with revenue. To travelers, he was an obstacle, often despised. His position required vigilance, for attempts to evade payment were constant. Merchants might slip through at night. Pilgrims might claim exemptions they did not possess, and local villagers might try to pass off goods as their own to avoid the higher charges applied to traders. The ledger, with its careful entries, became the toll collector's shield. A well-kept book defended him against accusations of negligence or dishonesty. Daily life in the toll house revolved around repetition. Dawn brought the first carts, creaking on wooden wheels. The collector would dip his quill in ink, note the entry, weigh the coin, and place it in the chest. Hours passed in a rhythm of greetings, arguments, counting, and writing. When trade was heavy, as during a fair or a harvest, the toll house became a bottleneck, travelers queuing impatiently. In quieter seasons, the collector might sit for hours with only the scratch of his pen for company. The work was not without risk. Roads attracted bandits, and a toll house with its chest of coins was an inviting target. Some collectors employed guards, while others relied on the protection of the Lord's soldiers. Yet theft was only one danger. Accusations of fraud could end a career more swiftly than a robber's blade. If money went missing, suspicion fell first on the man who handled it. For this reason, honesty was not only a virtue, but a matter of survival. Still, the position had advantages. Toll collectors often lived in the toll house itself, giving them shelter. Their wages could be steady, especially compared to the uncertain earnings of peasants. Some supplemented their income by selling food or drink to travelers, turning the toll house into a kind of roadside inn. Others forged relationships with merchants, offering leniency in exchange for favors. A shrewd collector could weave himself into the fabric of local trade, earning influence disproportionate to his humble station. The ledgers they kept remain one of the most fascinating windows into the mundane life of the Middle Ages. To modern eyes, they are dry documents, lists of items, numbers, sums, but hidden in those entries are stories of movement and exchange. A toll record might show an unusual influx of cloth, hinting at a distant fair. Another might reveal the passage of pilgrims bound for Santiago de Compostela or Rome. Grain entries could mark the onset of harvest, while sudden shortages might signal famine. In their monotony, the ledgers captured the pulse of a region's economy, yet behind each line lay human interactions, the tired voice of a carter bargaining for a lower rate, the toll collector's careful calculation of whether to grant it, the scratch of a quill fixing the decision into permanence. Such moments rarely make it into chronicles, but they defined the experience of countless medieval lives. One might ask, did the toll collectors themselves feel the weight of history as they dipped their pens? Or did they see only the ink and the coins, blind to the broader flows of commerce they recorded? A toll collector's ledger was more than a list of payments. It was an artifact of power. Each line in ink represented not just a sum of money, but an encounter between the governed and those who governed. For the medieval traveler, handing over coin was rarely a choice. It was a ritual of submission, a reminder that someone, a lord, an abbey, a crown, claimed authority over movement itself. The toll collector's job was to translate this invisible claim into tangible reality, one entry at a time. The rules governing tolls were often spelled out in charters. A king might grant a monastery the right to collect tolls at a bridge in perpetuity. A town might negotiate the authority to levy charges at its gates. Rates could be specified in detail. So much for cattle, so much for sacks of grain, so much for cloth by the bolt. Yet even the clearest charter left room for interpretation. A collector could classify a merchant's load in one way or another, shifting the rate subtly in favor of revenue. Disputes were inevitable, and they were recorded in the ledgers alongside payments for merchants. Tolls were a constant irritation. A journey from one town to another might involve half a dozen toll stations, each demanding coin. A cartload of goods could lose a significant share of its value before reaching market. Complaints filled petitions and records. Kings occasionally issued decrees to curb unjust tolls, but enforcement was weak. Local lords and abbots guarded their rights fiercely, and toll collectors, standing at the physical choke points of travel, had the last word. This tension often expressed itself in small acts of resistance. Merchants might underreport the weight of their loads. Pilgrims might claim exemptions by presenting forged letters of passage. Villagers might attempt to slip by toll houses at dawn or dusk, hoping the collector was too tired or distracted to stop them. The collector's ledger became a battleground. Every disputed entry, a miniature contest over wealth and authority. But ledgers also offered protection for the collector himself. If accused of pocketing funds, he could point to the meticulous pages showing coin matched to entry. If travelers accused him of overcharging, he could cite the recorded rates. The ledger was both shield and weapon, the tool by which he justified his role. Its neat columns of figures hid the mecenses of human encounters, reducing arguments, complaints, and negotiations into orderly script. Not all toll collectors were scrupulous. Some inflated charges, confident that weary travelers would pay rather than delay. Others struck deals with favored merchants, lowering their rates in exchange for bribes or gifts. Ledgers might be altered, coins slipped quietly into purses. In some cases, lords themselves turned a blind eye, preferring loyalty from their collectors over exact honesty. The toll system, like much of medieval administration, balanced uneasily between regulation and opportunism. The resentment of tolls sometimes boiled over into open conflict. Records survive of merchants banding together to resist what they deemed unjust charges, forming leagues and guilds that pressured rulers to regulate toll collection more fairly. In the Holy Roman Empire, disputes over tolls along the Rhine became notorious. Towns and princes set up competing stations along the river, each extracting fees until merchants complained bitterly of ruinous costs. Wars were fought, charters rewritten, ledgers seized as proof of rights. The role of monasteries is especially revealing. Many abbeys owned bridges and roads granted by pious rulers in exchange for prayers. Their toll collectors were monks or hired laymen, and their ledgers mixed spiritual with temporal concerns. Entries might record not only payments, but also notes of exemptions for fellow monks or for pilgrims traveling to holy shrines. To the abbey, tolls were part of God's order. To the merchant, they were yet another burden. The ledger preserved this clash of perspectives in its silent lines of ink. For ordinary peasants, tolls could cut into survival. A farmer bringing surplus vegetables to town faced not only the difficulty of transport, but also the cost of passage. To pay a penny toll might mean less bread on the table that week. For wealthier traders, the toll was an irritant to be factored into price. For the poor, it could be a genuine hardship. In this way, the ledger, so dry and bureaucratic to us, was in reality a record of sacrifice, small and large, endured by countless, nameless people. One can imagine the collector at day's end, closing the ledger, locking the chest, and reflecting on the day's disputes. Did he see himself as part of a just order, maintaining the road and bridge with the funds gathered? Or did he sense the simmering resentment in every glance, every muttered curse from travelers who passed under his gaze? What is striking is how such ordinary records, lists of goods, names, and sums could shape broader history. Tolls influenced trade routes, encouraging merchants to avoid expensive paths. They shaped towns as communities sought exemptions to attract commerce. They even influenced diplomacy as rulers bargained over rights to levy tolls in contested regions. Behind every grand charter or royal decree lay the humble ledger of the toll collector. Its pages filled one ink stroke at a time. And yet, for all this power, the collector himself remained a minor figure, often distrusted, occasionally envied, seldom admired. His life was measured in coins and pages, in daily repetition. But the resentments he provoked raised a question. How much could a system depend on ordinary men enforcing unpopular rules before resistance grew too strong to ignore? At the end of a long day, the toll collector's work was not done when the road emptied. He still had to reconcile his figures, count the coins, and ensure that every sum matched what was written in the ledger. A discrepancy, even a small one, could be dangerous. A lord might accuse him of theft. A monastery might question his honesty. The ink-stained ledger was his only defense, a fragile shield against suspicion. The life of a toll collector was one of monotony, punctuated by tension. Most days passed in repetition, carts arriving, coins exchanged, entries recorded. But the memory of disputes lingered. Merchants could be angry, peasants desperate, pilgrims indignant. The collector bore the brunt of frustrations, directed less at him personally than at the system he represented. If he was stern, he was called greedy. If he was lenient, he risked the wrath of his master. Few professions placed a man so squarely between two worlds, the ruled and the rulers, and yet this lowly work shaped medieval Europe in quiet but profound ways. The money gathered at toll stations funded repairs to bridges and roads, yes, but also filled the coffers of lords and abbots. A fortified bridge might stand longer because its toll was faithfully collected. A monastery might expand its cloister with revenue from carts that rattled across its bridge. In this way, each line of ink in the ledger contributed to the material landscape of the Middle Ages. Some collectors carved out a modest prosperity. Those stationed at busy trade routes could earn enough to live above subsistence, with food, clothing, and shelter relatively secure. A few even used their positions to rise socially, marrying into artisan families or purchasing small plots of land. Others ended in poverty, dismissed for corruption or overwhelmed by accusations. The toll collector's fate was as uncertain as the road itself. What became of the ledgers after the collector's death? Many were stored in manorial chests or monastery archives, bundled with charters and court rolls. A surprising number survive, their pages still legible centuries later. To us, they may appear dull, long lists of pigs, sacks, and coins, but to the historian, they are invaluable. They reveal what people carried, how often they traveled, and what they valued. They show patterns of famine and plenty, of war and peace, of shifting economies. Each line, once written to justify a toll, now serves as a window into the texture of daily life. As time passed, the toll system itself evolved. By the late Middle Ages, towns and cities grew stronger, and some negotiated exemptions from tolls to attract merchants. Trade leagues, like the Hanseatic League, pressured rulers to standardize and reduce tolls along key routes. In some places, collectors became more regulated, their accounts audited by civic authorities rather than left to local lords. Still, the basic ritual remained. At the crossing, a man with a ledger waited, and travelers paid before they passed. The resentment never fully faded. In the 16th and 17th centuries, when new states sought to centralize power, tolls became points of conflict once again. Merchants demanded free passage, rulers sought steady revenue, and collectors remained the face of an unpopular system. Even as Europe entered the modern age, the old dynamics of coin, ink, and complaint persisted today. When we look back at medieval toll ledgers, we find not drama, but detail. They tell us how many sheep crossed a bridge in a single day, how much salt traveled to market, how many barrels of wine rolled along the road. They give us numbers so ordinary they might seem meaningless. Yet it is precisely in this ordinariness that their value lies. History is built not only from battles and kings, but from the slow accumulation of such records, written by tired hands in dim toll houses. The toll collector himself remains a shadowy figure, his name rarely preserved, his voice never heard directly. But through his ledger, we glimpse the daily negotiations that structured medieval life, the constant exchange between authority and subject, the weary balancing of fairness and resentment, the flow of goods that sustained communities. Perhaps, then, the toll collector deserves a place in our imagination, not as a villain or a hero, but as a reminder of the countless anonymous men and women who made the machinery of society function. Without their steady ink and careful coin, the bridges might have crumbled, the lords gone poorer, the markets shrunk. So the next time you picture a medieval road, do not imagine only the merchant's cart or the pilgrim's sandals. Picture, too, the man at the gate, quill in hand, ledger before him, quietly turning human movement into lines of ink. For in those silent pages lies a record of an entire world, preserved not in glory, but in the boredom of bureaucracy. When you think of the 19th century, perhaps images of steam locomotives, iron bridges, or textile mills come to mind. Yet, one of the century's most pervasive inventions was far smaller: the matchstick. It was simple to carry, easy to use, and transformed daily life. Before matches, fire was coaxed from flint and steel, or borrowed from an existing flame. The arrival of the match placed fire at the fingertips of ordinary people, making it instantly available with a mere strike. The earliest versions of the match were crude. In the late 1820s, chemists experimented with sticks tipped with mixtures of chemicals that could ignite with friction. John Walker, an English pharmacist, is credited with producing the first commercial matches in 1826. He called them friction lights. They were unreliable and produced a foul odor, but they worked. From there, the idea spread quickly, and entrepreneurs across Europe saw the potential. By the 1830s and 1840s, match production shifted from individual chemists to small workshops. A typical match workshop was a modest affair, a few cramped rooms, long wooden tables, and bowls of chemical mixtures. Workers dipped thin sticks of wood into the prepared paste, laid them out to dry, and packed them into boxes. The process seemed simple, but it demanded endless repetition. A single worker might handle thousands of sticks in a day. Most of these workers were poor. Matchmaking became a common occupation for women and children, especially in industrial cities like London, Vienna, and Paris. Their wages were pitifully small. Yet even this meager income could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Contemporary reports describe barefoot girls carrying trays of drying matches, their fingers stained and their lungs irritated by chemical fumes. The key ingredient in many early matches was white phosphorus, a substance both effective and deadly. It gave matches their flair, but also poisoned those who handled it. The most notorious disease was phossy jaw, a horrific condition in which phosphorus fumes decayed the bones of the jaw, leaving victims disfigured and in agony. For many years, factory owners ignored the danger, preferring cheap production to workers' safety. But in the 1830s and 1840s, this darker reality was still unfolding quietly. The matchstick was still new, still novel, and its dangers were not widely understood. For most consumers, the little boxes sold by street vendors or shopkeepers represented convenience, not suffering. Matches, lit candles, stoves, and pipes. They illuminated workshops, kitchens, and taverns. Their impact spread into every corner of daily life. Yet their origins in sweat and sickness remained hidden. The industry grew rapidly. Matches became an indispensable household item, and demand soared. Small workshops multiplied, and soon larger factories emerged, churning out millions of sticks each week. The matchbox itself became a familiar sight, often decorated with bright labels to catch the eye. These labels, with their images of lions, ships, or crowns, disguised the bleak monotony behind their production. Consider the rhythms of a single workshop. Dawn broke, and workers filed into dim rooms heavy with the smell of sulfur and phosphorus. Tables were covered with trays of thin splints cut from cheap wood. The workers dipped them, laid them flat, turned them carefully to dry, and repeated the process until their backs ached. Children, nimble and small-fingered, often packed the finished matches into tiny boxes, sealing them with paste. The air was thick, and the pay was thin, but the work was steady, steadier, at least, than street hawking or casual day labor. The ledger of a workshop owner tells a different story. Costs of wood, chemicals, and labor balanced against sales at market stalls and wholesale contracts. To him, the match was not a tool of survival, but a source of profit. Each worker was a line item, each box of matches a unit of revenue. The humanity of those bent over tables was invisible in the neat columns of accounts, and yet, without those human hands, the match industry could not have existed. It grew in the shadows of industrialization, fueled by desperation, repetition, and the demand for fire at a moment's notice. By the mid-19th century, the match had become so ordinary that people rarely thought about its origins. Fire, once elusive and laborious to create, now came in small wooden splinters sold for pennies. But beneath this convenience lay an unspoken question. How long could an industry built on fragile health, child labor, and dangerous chemicals continue before the quiet suffering behind each flame came into the light. By the middle of the 19th century, the match industry was no longer a collection of small workshops alone. It had matured into an international trade, with large factories supplying millions of boxes each year. Matches were now manufactured in Britain, France, Germany, Austria, Sweden, and beyond. The product had become universal, yet its production was deeply local, rooted in the urban poor who labored at long benches for meager pay in London. The largest and most notorious of the factories was Bryant and May. Established in 1843, its sprawling buildings in the East End employed hundreds of workers, most of them young women and girls. From the outside, the factory looked like a triumph of industry. Inside, however, it carried the same toxic air and repetitive toil that had defined the smaller workshops. The rhythm of production was relentless. Wooden splints arrived in bulk, cut mechanically from logs. These were then dipped in sulfur, dried, and tipped with a paste containing white phosphorus. Workers packed the dried matches into thin, wooden, or cardboard boxes, often assembling and labeling thousands in a single day. A day's wages for such labor might be less than a single shilling, barely enough for bread, rent, and coal. But the most feared shadow hanging over workers was phosphorus poisoning. Reports from factory inspectors described the gruesome consequences: a toothache that would not heal, swelling of the gums, and eventually the dreaded phossy jaw. The disease not only disfigured but often killed. The connection between phosphorus and illness became known by the 1850s, yet factory owners resisted reform. White phosphorus was cheap, and alternatives such as red phosphorus were more expensive to handle. In Paris and Vienna, similar conditions prevailed. Match factories became symbols of industrial exploitation, where women's health and children's futures were quietly consumed in the pursuit of profit. Yet, because matches were so indispensable to daily life, the suffering of the workers rarely entered public discussion. A box of matches sat innocently on a kitchen shelf, with no hint of the human cost it carried. It was only when workers began to organize that the silence broke. In 1888, a famous strike erupted at Bryant and May's London factory. More than 1,400 women walked out, protesting not only the low wages, but also the fines imposed for trivial mistakes and the deadly health hazards of phosphorus. These match girls, as the newspapers called them, were young, many still teenagers, yet they carried themselves with determination. Their strike drew attention from reformers and the public, revealing the hidden misery behind the humble matchbox. The strike itself was brief but effective. Public sympathy swelled, and journalists printed harrowing accounts of the women's working lives. The company, under pressure, agreed to concessions, including higher wages and better conditions. More importantly, the strike demonstrated the power of collective action, especially among groups of workers previously dismissed as powerless. The match girls became a symbol of working-class resistance, and their victory encouraged other labor movements. Meanwhile, governments across Europe began to regulate the industry. By the 1890s, campaigns against white phosphorus gained momentum. In some countries, taxes were levied on phosphorus matches to encourage safer alternatives. In others, outright bans were introduced. Sweden, in particular, led the way with the development of the safety match, which used red phosphorus and could only be struck on a special surface. This innovation reduced both accidental fires and the dangers to workers. Still, the transition was slow. For decades, white phosphorus matches remained cheaper and therefore more common, especially among the poor. The dangerous substance lingered in factories long after its hazards were well known. Reform was not simply a matter of invention. It required overcoming entrenched economic interests and indifference to the plight of the working class. The match industry also shaped urban economies in subtler ways. For the poor, the matchbox became a token of survival, not only through labor, but also through street trade. Match sellers, often women, widows, or children, stood at street corners with trays of boxers, hoping to sell a few before nightfall. Their earnings were slim, but the trade required little capital. A handful of boxes could be purchased wholesale and sold at a margin, making it one of the few accessible occupations for the destitute. Social reformers noticed these figures, the match sellers in ragged clothes, and wrote about them as symbols of poverty. The image of the street seller became famous in literature as well. Most poignantly in Hans Christian Andersen's 1845 tale, The Little Match Girl. Though fictional, the story resonated because it reflected a visible reality: children shivering in the cold, clutching boxes of matches as both livelihood and fragile hope. Yet, despite this awareness, little changed quickly. For many decades, the match industry remained a quiet machine of production, profit, and pain. It grew steadily, consumed silently, and left scars, both physical and social, that were easy to overlook. The industry was never glamorous, never heroic, but it was deeply telling of the industrial age. It revealed how the comforts of modern life, in this case, the ease of striking a flame, were built on the overlooked endurance of the many. As the 19th century drew to a close, change finally accelerated. The labor movement gained strength, chemical knowledge advanced, and governments yielded to calls for regulation. But the question lingered: could an industry so bound to poverty and exploitation truly transform? Or would the match forever remain a symbol of industrial progress purchased at human cost? The dawn of the 20th century marked a slow but undeniable transformation in the match industry. For nearly 3/4 of a century, white phosphorus had reigned, shaping the lives of workers and consumers alike. Its dangers were known but tolerated. Its convenience prioritized over the health of those who dipped, packed, and boxed the little sticks. By the 1890s, however, pressure mounted from reformers, doctors, and governments to ban its use. The turning point came with international agreements. In 1906, at a conference in Bern, the European nations signed a convention to prohibit the manufacture and sale of white phosphorus matches. The so-called Bern Convention on Phosphorus Matches was one of the first international treaties aimed specifically at protecting workers' health. Though not every country ratified it immediately, the tide had shifted. The once accepted risks of match production were now framed as unacceptable hazards. Sweden, long a leader in match innovation, provided the alternative. The Swedish chemist Gustav Erik Pask had developed the safety match in the 1840s, and the engineer Johann Edvard Lundström refined it for commercial production. Unlike its dangerous cousin, the safety match relied on red phosphorus, which was far more stable and far less toxic. The striking surface was separated from the match head, reducing both accidental ignition and exposure to fumes. By the early 20th century, the Swedish safety match became the global standard. Factories gradually adapted, though not without resistance. The switch required retooling equipment and processes, and it often meant higher costs. Yet consumers began to favor safety matches, especially as public awareness grew. Governments reinforced this shift by banning or heavily taxing the old phosphorus matches. Slowly, the deadly splinters of the 19th century disappeared from workshops and markets. For the workers, conditions improved, though only by degrees. Phosphates declined as white phosphorus disappeared, but match factories still demanded long hours of monotonous labor. The wages remained low, and the work remained unskilled. Even so, the elimination of the most severe health hazard was a profound change, sparing thousands from suffering and disfigurement. The match industry also became a mirror for larger shifts in industrial labor. The 1888 match girls' strike had already shown that workers, even those dismissed as powerless, could influence public opinion and corporate behavior. Later reforms in the match industry reflected the growing role of organized labor, public health advocacy, and international cooperation. What began as a story of hidden suffering gradually transformed into one of resilience and reform by the mid-20th century. However, the match itself began to lose its central role in daily life. The invention of the safety lighter, followed by disposable plastic lighters, offered a rival means of producing flame. Matches, once indispensable, became secondary, used mainly in households for lighting stoves, candles, or fireplaces. The heyday of the match industry had passed. Factories closed or shifted production to smaller scales. In some places, such as Sweden, matches remained a point of national pride, their labels a symbol of craftsmanship. In others, they lingered as a cheap commodity, their boxers stacked in shops and markets. But the immense scale of match production in the 19th century, the rows of workers dipping splints, the warehouses filled with labeled boxes, slowly faded into history. Yet the legacy of the industry endures. It reveals how something as small as a matchstick could reshape daily life. With it came fire on demand, altering how people cooked, heated, and illuminated their homes. It also reveals the hidden costs of industrial progress, the suffering of workers, the risks borne by the poor, and the struggles required to bring about reform. The match also serves as a reminder of forgotten resilience. The young women of Bryant and May, the children who packed boxes for pennies, the street sellers clutching their trays, they were not celebrated inventors or captains of industry. Yet their labor lit countless homes, fueled progress, and sparked change. Their story is not one of glamour, but of endurance. Today, when you pick up a box of matches, perhaps as a backup in a kitchen drawer, you hold the ghost of that history. Each small stick represents a century of toil, of poison and protest, of transformation from peril to safety. The industry rose quietly, spread globally, and declined without fanfare. Yet, in its quiet rise and fall, it left a trail of lessons about work, technology, and the cost of convenience. And so, the story of the match ends not with a blaze, but with a steady glow, the reminder that history is often found in the smallest, dullest objects, and that even the most boring of industries can strike sparks that change the world. The year in a tenement block began, as so many years did, with winter. Cold pressed through the thin walls and rattled windows. Coal, if it could be afforded, burned quickly in the small grates. Otherwise, families huddled together beneath blankets, their breath visible in the air. In London, Glasgow, Manchester, and other growing industrial cities, entire families often shared a single room. These were not the grand townhouses of novels, but subdivided lodgings, each partitioned to squeeze as many tenants as possible into the building. The structure itself was usually old by the time it became a tenement. A large townhouse, once built for merchants or professionals, was divided. The ground floor might still retain traces of paneling or plaster decoration, but most of the rooms were stripped bare, patched with mismatched boards, and covered with soot. Stairs creaked with every step. Water seeped through ceilings, and plaster crumbled from damp corners. A single tenement block might house dozens of families. Each room became a universe of necessity. Cooking, sleeping, and working crammed into a few square yards. Privacy was a luxury unknown to most. Thin walls carried the sounds of crying babies, quarrels, and the scrape of chairs. Shared privies in the yard served dozens of tenants, often without proper drainage. Buckets were carried up and down stairs. The smell lingered, no matter the season. Life in winter was measured in small economies. A penny saved on bread meant a halfpenny left for coal. A borrowed candle allowed one more evening of stitching or mending. Mothers sewed by dim light, while children fetched water or scavenged scraps of wood to stretch the fire. Hunger was constant, though rarely named aloud. The landlord was a distant figure, often represented by an agent or rent collector. Once a week, he came knocking. Coins had to be ready. Falling behind meant eviction, and eviction meant the street. The ledger of the rent collector told its own story. Names of tenants, amounts due, occasional notes about arrears. It was business, impersonal, and relentless. For the tenants, the ledger was life or death. Illness was another companion of winter. The damp rooms, crowded beds, and shared privies bred coughs and fevers. Consumption, typhus, and influenza spread quickly. Doctors were rarely affordable. Instead, remedies passed from neighbor to neighbor. Onion poultices, mustard plasters, or simple rest, if rest could be found. Children were especially vulnerable, and their cries echoed in stairwells long into the night. Yet, within this hardship, life continued with rhythms of endurance. Women washed clothes in cold water, their hands red and raw. Men, if fortunate enough to have steady work, rose early to labor in factories, docks, or workshops. Children played in the courtyards, their games improvised from scraps, their laughter defiant against the bleakness of their surroundings. The tenement was more than walls. It was a community bound by necessity. Neighbors shared gossip, lent needles, or watched each other's children. Arguments erupted over noise or privy use, but reconciliations followed. Survival depended not only on individual effort, but also on the fragile threads of solidarity. And so winter passed, slowly measured in weeks of rent, in coughs that lingered, in small fires that warmed only briefly. The tenement endured. Work opportunities changed. The streets filled with noise, and the tenement block entered a new season of struggle and adaptation. as winter gave way to spring. The tenement changed character. The days grew longer, and the damp air inside the rooms gave way to the smells of the courtyard. Windows, where glass panes remained intact, were opened to let in light. Those without windows propped open doors to the landing, hoping for a breath of fresh air. In some cases, it was cobbled. In others, nothing more than dirt packed hard by many feet. At its center might stand a single water pump, serving the entire building. Queues formed each morning as women and children filled buckets, balanced pails, and carried water back up narrow staircases. Washing days meant the courtyard was filled with steam from boiling tubs, lines strung between walls, and dripping clothes that absorbed the soot from chimneys even as they dried. The warmer air brought relief from the chill of winter, but also its own troubles. Flies swarmed, drawn to the open privies, and piles of refuse that collected faster than they were removed. Children ran barefoot, their laughter echoing against the walls, but cuts and scrapes turned easily to infections. In the crowded tenement, disease was never far away. Still, spring was also a season of renewal. Men sought out work more easily as building projects resumed and docks grew busier. Women took in laundry, sewing, or street selling. Some made their way to markets, carrying trays of flowers, sweets, or matchboxes to earn a few pennies. The streets outside the tenement were alive with vendors, carts, and costermongers, each calling out their wares. The sounds drifted through the windows, mingling with the constant clatter of footsteps on stairs. Inside the rooms, light revealed the cracks and stains hidden by winter's gloom. Tenants patched walls with rags or paper, stuffed cloth into window gaps, and rearranged furniture to make space. Space, however, was always scarce. Families of 6 or 7 still slept in a single room, the youngest in drawers or makeshift cradles. Privacy remained almost unknown. Summer intensified every discomfort. Heat built beneath the slates of the roof, and the upper rooms became ovens. Lower floors, damp in winter, turned close and airless. With open windows came the noise of the street, horses' hooves, hawkers' cries, the clang of factory bells. Sleep was shallow, often broken by quarrels, by infants' cries, or by the heavy tread of late-returning workers. Yet summer also meant the chance to step outside. Children spent long hours in the courtyard, or wandered into alleys, playing marbles, skipping, or chasing hoops. Their games were noisy, occasionally leading to scolding from tired neighbors, but they filled the air with life. Women sat together on doorsteps, sewing or peeling vegetables, exchanging news about rents, illnesses, or the price of bread. The tenement was crowded, but it was not silent. It hummed with the voices of those who could not afford solitude. Illness, too, had its seasons. Summer brought outbreaks of diarrheal diseases, particularly among infants. The water supply, shared by so many, was easily contaminated. Doctors' visits were rare. More often, mothers turned to neighbors for advice, or to patent medicines sold cheaply on street corners. Some remedies were little more than colored water, but desperation made them seem worth the gamble. Rent collection remained as relentless in summer as in winter. Agents arrived weekly, tallying arrears with cold efficiency. If payment could not be made, the threat of eviction loomed. For many families, Summer wages offered brief relief, allowing debts to be cleared. For others, illness or irregular work meant the cycle of arrears deepened. Evictions were sudden and brutal, furniture carried into the street, possessions piled in the open, families left to beg for shelter elsewhere. Despite all this, there were moments of celebration. Holidays such as May Day or local fairs offered respite. Families, dressed in their best clothes, often second-hand but carefully mended, and joined the crowds. The tenement emptied, if only for a day, its stairwells quiet, while its residents mingled in the wider world. For children, a sweet or a penny toy from a fair could be remembered for months afterward. Through spring and summer, the tenement block was a world of contrasts, life bursting with noise and play. Even as hunger and disease lingered in the background, it was a place where every penny mattered, every quarrel echoed, and every gesture of kindness was magnified by need. And as the days grew shorter again, autumn approached, bringing its own cycles of labor, scarcity, and survival. The year in the tenement was not a story of triumph or disaster, but of constant adaptation, of endurance, measured season by season. Autumn came quietly to the tenement block. The evenings shortened, and the air grew cool again. In the courtyards, the last of the summer laundry flapped stiffly on the lines, taking longer to dry in the weaker sunlight. Families prepared for another cold season, patching clothes, storing coal where they could afford it, and saving pennies against the rising price of food. The smell of damp returned quickly. Rain seeped through leaky roofs and pooled on stairwell landings. Rooms that had been stifling in summer now felt clammy, their walls sweating moisture. Wallpaper peeled away in strips, and black patches of mold spread in corners. Some families tried to fight the damp with fires, but fuel was expensive. More often, they endured it, coughing into the night. Autumn was also the season of school openings. Elementary education had become more widespread by the later 19th century, though attendance was irregular in poor districts. Some children went to class with bare feet and empty stomachs, carrying slates and chalk. Others stayed home to work, carrying water, running errands, or minding younger siblings while parents labored. Education promised escape, but survival in the present often demanded sacrifice of the future. The work available to adults shifted with the season. Harvest brought casual labor for some men, though in the cities, work at docks and factories remained the staple. Employment was still uncertain. A strike at a nearby mill, a downturn in orders, or an accident could plunge a family into immediate crisis. Without savings, they relied on neighbors, pawn shops, or credit from local shopkeepers. Pawn tickets became a kind of currency, with coats, boots, and blankets pledged repeatedly across the year. As winter returned, the tenement once again settled into its hardest rhythm. Fires burned low, if at all. The sound of coughing grew louder in stairwells. The privies froze, making their use all the more unpleasant. Rats sought shelter indoors, scurrying across floors at night. Families huddled closer, layering rags as blankets, boiling scraps of bone for broth, and making candles last by trimming their wicks carefully. The rent collector remained punctual, his knock as regular as church bells. Tenants braced for it, clutching coins if they had them, or excuses if they did not. Some pleaded for a few days' grace. Others avoided the door altogether, knowing the agent would soon return. Eviction in winter was especially cruel, but it happened all the same. Yet, even amid hardship, the tenement had its rituals of endurance. Neighbors still exchanged bits of coal or a loaf of bread when they could spare them. Women still gathered on stairwells to share stories while darning socks or peeling vegetables. Children still found ways to play, their games echoing against the stone. Life persisted, not because it was easy, but because there was no other choice. The turn of the year brought familiar observances. Christmas in the tenement was modest, perhaps a candle, a scrap of meat, or a second-hand toy for the children. Families crowded together, telling stories, singing hymns, or simply sharing warmth. The tenement was poor, but it was not devoid of humanity. Small gestures of celebration stood out all the more because they were rare. And then, as the calendar turned again, the cycle resumed. Another year of work, rent, illness, and survival. The walls remained the same, the stairwells echoed with the same sounds, and the struggles carried on. The tenement block did not change much, nor did the lives within it. What changed was the accumulation of years, children growing into workers, families shifting rooms, some departing through eviction or death, others arriving to take their place. The story of a Victorian tenement is not one of sudden transformation, but of constant endurance. Each season was predictable, yet each brought its own challenges. Together they formed a rhythm of survival that defined working-class urban life. The tenement block stood through it all, a silent witness to thousands of ordinary lives lived in extraordinary proximity. And so, as another winter settled in, the question remained, how long could families continue to live this way? In rooms so small, under conditions so harsh, before society itself was forced to change. In Renaissance Florence, bread was more than food. It was survival, a daily necessity for rich and poor alike. The city, bustling with merchants, bankers, and artisans, depended on a steady supply of loaves to feed its tens of thousands of inhabitants. Behind the elegance of palaces and the brilliance of art, a quieter story unfolded each day in the ovens of the Bakers' Guild. The Guild of Bakers was one of the lesser-known craft guilds of Florence. It did not carry the prestige of the silk weavers, nor the influence of the wool merchants. It was not tied to high-banking families or to the patrons of great artists, but its role was no less vital. Without bread, there could be no city life, no workshops humming with labor, no students copying manuscripts by candlelight. The guild ensured that ovens burned day and night, producing the loaves that lined market stalls and filled baskets. Florence was no stranger to hunger. Famines struck repeatedly in the late Middle Ages, sometimes brought on by war, sometimes by bad harvests, sometimes by trade disruption. The memory of empty markets haunted the city, and bread riots were not uncommon when prices rose beyond what ordinary families could bear. The Bakers' Guild, therefore, operated not only as a trade association, but also as a safeguard of civic stability. Regulations governed the price, weight, and quality of loaves. Bakers were inspected, fined, and sometimes shamed if their bread was too light or poorly made. The daily rhythms of a baker's life were punishing. Ovens had to be stoked long before dawn, when most of the city still slept. Apprentices hauled sacks of flour, measured water, and kneaded dough in great wooden troughs. Journeymen shaped loaves by hand, arranging them in baskets or on peels, ready for the oven. Heat radiated from the stone walls, filling the workshop with the scent of yeast and smoke. By sunrise, the first batches were ready, carried to shops or stalls where customers waited with coins in hand. Flour itself was a matter of constant negotiation. Much of it came from the countryside surrounding Florence, ground in mills along the Arno and its tributaries. Grain prices rose and fell with the harvest, and shortages were felt first in the city. The Bakers' Guild worked closely with civic authorities to secure supplies, sometimes drawing from emergency granaries. A well-run city was judged not only by its art or its politics, but by the steady presence of affordable bread on its tables. The guild also functioned as a fraternity. Bakers swore oaths, attended meetings, and contributed to common funds. They participated in religious festivals, marched in processions, and maintained altars in local churches. Their banners, less ornate than those of richer guilds, still carried meaning, symbolizing the dignity of their craft. For young men entering the trade, the guild provided structure, apprenticeship, training, and eventually the chance to open one's own bakery. Yet the work was precarious. Ovens consumed wood, which had to be purchased. Flour supplies could be interrupted by poor harvests or political conflict. Customers were quick to complain if bread seemed too costly, too small, or too coarse. The city government kept a watchful eye, aware that unrest could spark from something as simple as a loaf of bread that no longer filled a hungry stomach. In these rhythms, flour bought, dough kneaded, loaves baked, coins collected, lay the quiet labor that sustained Florence. The artists who painted frescoes, the merchants who brokered silk, the scholars who debated philosophy, all depended on bread baked before dawn. And yet, for all their importance, the bakers of Florence rarely left their names in history. Their guild records survive only in fragments, scattered across archives, overshadowed by the more powerful trades. The story of their ovens is a story of endurance, not glory of men and women whose labor vanished each day as loaves were consumed, leaving nothing but crumbs behind. As the Renaissance unfolded with its triumphs of art and finance, what role did this humble guild play in shaping the city's stability? And why did its influence eventually fade into obscurity? If you imagine Florence at its height, the soaring dome of Brunelleschi, the banking houses of the Medici, the wealth of wool and silk merchants, you might forget the more fragile layer beneath. The ordinary people who survived day by day. Their most pressing concern was often not art or politics, but bread. The Bakers' Guild, the Arte dei Forni, existed to ensure this need was met, and its records reveal a world of exacting detail, caution, and constant negotiation. The guild maintained ledgers. These were not filled with grand accounts of trade across seas, as the merchants' records were, nor did they chart fortunes that shaped dynasties. Instead, they listed sacks of grain purchased, firewood acquired, ovens repaired, fines imposed, and loaves sold. The handwriting was neat but unadorned, columns carefully ruled. An inspector could open a book and see whether a baker had sold bread at the approved weight and price, whether dues had been paid, or whether complaints had been lodged by customers. Every loaf had to meet a standard. Too heavy, and the baker lost money. Too light, and the baker faced penalties. The guild, working with city officials, checked ovens and weighed loaves, ensuring consistency. This was not simply a matter of fairness, but of public order. Bread riots had scarred Florence in earlier generations, sparked when the price of bread rose too high during lean harvests. Bakers carried a heavy burden. They were both producers and guardians of civic peace. The regulations extended beyond bread itself. Bakers could not mix inferior grains without permission. They could not sell stale bread without marking it as such. They could not hoard flour in anticipation of shortages. Their hours were dictated by the rhythms of the city. Bread must be available by morning, ready for families, laborers, and artisans beginning their work. The ovens themselves were inspected, and if found unsafe or inefficient, bakers might be ordered to rebuild them. Apprenticeship was central to the guild's structure. A boy, and occasionally, though less often, a girl, might be placed under the care of a master baker at around 12 or 13 years old. The apprenticeship lasted several years, during which the apprentice would learn to knead dough, shape loaves, and manage ovens. Much of this was sheer physical endurance, carrying flour sacks that weighed as much as the boy himself, working in the punishing heat, and sleeping in corners of the bakery when the night's work demanded it. At the end of his apprenticeship, he might become a journeyman, moving from shop to shop until he could afford the dues and equipment required to open his own oven. But Florence was never free from the specter of scarcity. Bad weather could ruin a harvest, and when grain imports faltered, prices rose. In such times, the Bakers' Guild was caught between the anger of the public. City officials sometimes intervened, setting maximum prices or requiring bakers to bake bread for less profit, the losses covered by emergency funds. Other times, bakers themselves bore the strain, working longer hours for smaller margins, their ledgers reflecting the slow erosion of earnings. The role of women in this trade was often quiet, but it was not absent. Many bakers' wives worked beside their husbands, kneading dough, minding shops, and keeping household accounts. In some cases, widows continued bakeries after their husbands' deaths, though formal guild recognition was harder to secure. Their contributions are often invisible in records, but traces remain, small notations of payments made by the widow of a baker or fines imposed on women who sold bread in the markets without proper guild affiliation. What makes the Bakers' Guild particularly striking is how anonymous it seems. While the names of famous painters, bankers, and sculptors echo across centuries, the bakers' names vanish into lists of fines, dues, and contracts. Their guild was essential but uncelebrated, their work disappearing as quickly as bread was eaten. Theirs was a history without monuments, a story preserved in ledgers rather than in frescoes, and yet the bakers were not powerless. By controlling the ovens and managing the city's most basic need, they held leverage. City councils could not ignore them. They marched in civic parades, their banners depicting bread, ovens, or wheat stalks. They participated in religious festivals, carrying offerings of bread to churches, their loaves stacked as symbols of abundance. In these moments, their otherwise quiet profession became visible, woven into the fabric of civic pride. But beneath this visibility lay tension. When shortages occurred, bakers could be accused of cheating or hoarding. In times of plenty, their work was taken for granted. Their position was always precarious, balanced between necessity and suspicion. They lived in a world where a poorly weighed loaf might provoke fines, and an empty stall might provoke anger from neighbors who expected their daily bread. The Renaissance celebrated human achievement, yet for bakers achievement was measured in loaves turned from dough to crust each morning, in ledgers balanced, in fines avoided. Their guild was not glamorous, but it endured, adapting to the city's needs and surviving where others faltered. As Florence grew wealthier and more powerful, the Bakers' Guild began to fade in comparison to the grander guilds that dominated politics and patronage. Their records grew sparse, their influence less obvious. Why did this happen? Was it the steady control of civic authorities, or the slow erosion of their independence under the weight of larger forces? The Arte dei Furna, like many of Florence's minor guilds, entered the Renaissance with purpose and necessity. They fed a city that prided itself on learning, commerce, and art. Yet by the 16th century, their presence began to fade. This was not the collapse of a single dramatic event, but rather a slow erosion, a quiet decline marked by diminishing records, lessened influence, and the gradual absorption of their work into broader structures of the city. The reasons were many, and none were especially dramatic. The most immediate was the shifting hierarchy of guilds themselves. Florence's guild system was divided into arti maggiori, the major guilds, and arti minori, the minor ones. The bakers belonged to the latter, and though their work was essential, their political influence never matched that of the wool merchants, silk weavers, or bankers. Over time, the political dominance of the arti maggiori left little room for the smaller trades to assert themselves. The bakers, bound by regulation and supervision, found their guild reduced more to a tool of oversight than a voice of power. Civic authorities, too, played their part. Because bread was so vital, the government of Florence increasingly took direct control over its regulation. Prices, weights, and even baking schedules were determined less by guild decrees and more by city statutes. Inspectors sent by civic offices replaced guild-appointed officials, and fines went into city coffers rather than guild funds. What began as a cooperative relationship between the bakers and the city became one in which the guild's autonomy steadily diminished. Economic shifts also contributed. As Florence's trade expanded, grain supplies became less predictable. Wars in Italy disrupted imports, and changing trade routes redirected commerce away from the Arno Valley. The bakers, caught in this turbulence, often became scapegoats for shortages they could not control. Public anger turned quickly toward those who sold bread, even if the root causes lay in distant conflicts or failed harvests. Bakers became more vulnerable to suspicion, and their guild less capable of defending them. Technology, too, altered the landscape. The growth of larger, more centralized bakeries began to overshadow the smaller, family-run ovens. With greater resources, these larger establishments could dominate markets, leaving smaller bakers struggling to survive. As individual shops closed or merged, the guild's membership thinned, apprenticeships declined, and the once carefully structured path from boyhood to master baker became less certain. By the 17th century, the records of the Arte dei Forni are sparse. A few fines, a few contracts, scattered notes of disputes, and then silence. The guild did not vanish in a blaze of controversy, nor was it ceremonially dissolved. It simply dwindled, absorbed into larger civic frameworks, its functions taken over by municipal offices. And yet, though the guild itself was lost, its legacy endured in quieter ways. The regulation of bread, pioneered by the bakers and enforced through their ledgers, continued to shape urban governance. Cities across Europe adopted similar systems, balancing supply and demand, price and weight, in an effort to maintain peace. The model Florence developed, with its close supervision of bakers, became a template for other urban centers grappling with the problem of feeding growing populations. Even more enduring was the cultural presence of bread in Florence. Recipes, techniques, and traditions passed from master to apprentice, from husband to wife, from family to family. The famous pane ciocco of Tuscany, unsalted bread with its distinct taste, is a direct descendant of these centuries of practice, shaped in part by the taxes on salt that once made it too costly to use in ordinary loaves. To taste it today is to taste the quiet survival of the baker's art. Even if their guild has long been forgotten, the anonymity of these bakers is itself telling. Their names rarely appear in chronicles or histories. Their work produced no lasting monuments, but every fresco painter, every banker, every philosopher of Florence depended on their bread. Their labor dissolved each day, consumed, digested, and gone. Yet without it, the splendor of Florence could not have flourished. The silence of their decline raises a question. How many other guilds, trades, and lives followed the same path, essential in their time, forgotten in the centuries that followed? The Bakers' Guild may be lost to history, but in its quiet disappearance lies a reflection of how societies survive. Not only through the brilliance of their great figures, but through the daily, repetitive work of those whose names are no longer remembered. And so the ovens cooled, the ledgers closed, and the guild banners no longer marched in processions, but the loaves continued, baked each dawn as they always had been. The guild was gone, yet the bread remained, the true measure of their legacy. These are not the stories of kings or conquerors, but of the quieter lives that shaped our past. Bakers who rose before dawn, toll-keepers who counted coins by candlelight, and workers who built their days around ledgers, loaves, and long-forgotten rules. Their histories may seem ordinary, even dull, but in their details lies the true rhythm of survival. Tonight, we will wander slowly through these forgotten corners of the past, tracing the hidden patterns of daily life, one story at a time. Settle in, let the pace carry you gently, and allow history's quiet voices to keep you company as you drift to sleep.